All right. Thank you, Debbie, so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here in part because I just barely escaped a blizzard to get over here, which I'm excited that I made it. And perhaps more importantly, because today I get to talk through how we design agentic workflows, how we design them, and then also the best way to use human in the loop when we're doing that. A real quick note, when I say agentic workflows, I'm talking about AI systems where the output of that system is an agent who is making a decision or taking an action. And when I say human in the loop, I'm talking about any time that a human is required to interact before that decision can be made. Okay, so before I dig into that, a quick note about myself and about my team. As Debbie mentioned, I now lead the product and design teams at CNN, and I've spent almost my entire career working on consumer products, particularly streaming video products. And now, as a product leader at CNN, I have two sets of customers. One is hundreds of millions of news consumers all over the world, but also importantly is our journalists. And we make products that support production across all of our platforms as well. So when we're thinking about building products at CNN, we are always thinking about what are the product experiences that are going to be the most compelling storytelling for the stories that our users care the most about. And then also we are thinking about how do we scale up those experiences quickly. We are always thinking about how do we deliver more value to more users faster, and agents offer us a unique and one of the most compelling opportunities we have ever had to be able to scale quickly. And that puts us really on this spectrum between kind of full control of outcomes, full control of outcomes over here, and full agency on the other side. And so I would guess that the general direction of travel for most of us here today is to move kind of more towards that agency side of the spectrum, because that unlocks scaling quickly, as I mentioned. It can offer unprecedented levels of personalization so that everybody is getting the very best version of our products. And it can also open new avenues for user value. But at the same time, the unpredictability of the agent introduces risks into the system. So if the agent takes an action that is not what we expect, we could risk user trust. And if it makes a decision that's inconsistent with our brand values, we could risk brand integrity. And then ultimately, that can put business outcomes on the line as well. Human in the loop is one way that we often mitigate those risks. But the problem is the way that human in the loop is employed, it often serves as a bottleneck that slows us down or a sort of gate that keeps us from getting to where we want to be on that spectrum. So today I want to talk about a framework for using human in the loop when we're interacting with agents that's more of a strategic allocation of judgment that actually helps us move faster. And then here I wanted to note also that the goal isn't zero human involvement necessarily. The goal is really to allocate the human judgment to the part of the system that's most impactful so we can actually unlock agency without undermining trust. So user trust is something that's very close to my heart. As I mentioned, I work on a news product, and so user trust in the quality and the accuracy and the fairness of the information that we offer is non-negotiable. And so for us, we have a sort of risk judgment that says 100% of our journalism is human accountable. But that doesn't mean that we can't leverage agents, and also user trust is in no way unique to news. Every product has some dimension of user trust. It could be quality, could be reliability, but in the end, the challenge for us as product leaders is going to be the same, which is we have to make decisions about what risk is acceptable, where judgment belongs in the system, and then ultimately, how do we scale up without undermining the very thing that users come to us for? Okay, so how does human in the loop become a bottleneck or a crutch? For one thing, human in the loop scales linearly, so for every decision that a human needs to make, you're adding cost into the mix. And humans tend to have inconsistent outcomes because different reviewers are going to bring sort of different backgrounds, different decision trees, and come up with different results. In addition to that, when we leverage human in the loop less as a strategic allocation of judgment and more as a way of counteracting a lack of confidence in the agent, there are some organizational things that get in our way. So one is, if we're relying on humans to counteract the lack of confidence, that can actually delay or prevent us from making the system-level changes that the agent needs to get better over time. It can also allow our product teams to not have a crisp definition of success because you can always sort of rely on somebody to have judgment to fix it. And then lastly, if human in the loop is employed because of a lack of confidence in the agent, you kind of get this effect where people start to introduce workarounds, and then that sort of undermines the value of agency in the first place. So these aren't limitations of humans inherently, but really how we use human in the loop. So how can we do it in a way that helps us speed up? In this case, we want to think about human in the loop more as a strategic allocation of judgment, in which case the really key question here is, where does judgment actually have an outsized impact? And so there's three things to think about here. One is where outcomes are ambiguous. So anytime you are dealing with nuance or context or a values judgment, that is where judgment is really powerful. So for example, for us, for editorial tools, we think of human judgment not for fact-checking, did a certain event occur at a certain time, for example, but it's much more powerful for something as nuanced as fairness standards, for example. So figuring out if a certain interview question has bias in it. The second thing to think about here is when the consequences are potentially irreversible or alternatively really reputationally costly, right? So as I mentioned at the outset, for us, the reputational cost of anything going wrong with our journalism is non-negotiable. That is why we have human accountability for all of our journalism. But you could also think about something like archiving. We have millions of hours of video footage from journalists all over the world, and so we are constantly making decisions about what footage should be deleted and what footage should be archived. That decision, if an agent were to make it, could be potentially irreversible, but it's not going to have anywhere near the reputational cost of messing with our journalism. And then lastly, the thing to think about is judgment is very powerful when it actually improves the system, so when it actually makes the system better over time. Okay, so how do we operationalize that? If we're trying to think about where does judgment have a really outsized impact, there's four kind of key questions to answer in designing the workflow. The first question here is, when does a human step in? The second question to think about is, when a human does get involved, what are they actually doing? And then third, what happens after the human acts? And then the last thing to think through is, how does that ultimately sort of change over time? So digging in here to the first question, what makes a really good trigger for human in the loop? The first thing to think about here is solving for product risk. And this is not just about figuring out how confident your agent feels, but more about how bad is it going to be if your agent makes the wrong decision. If we base human review or the trigger for human review solely on the confidence of the agent, we can end up in scenarios where humans end up reviewing a lot of edge cases that end up being sort of low stakes decisions. So one example of this is if you have an agent involved in subscription management that is making decisions about when to issue a refund, you might have an edge case where a certain subscriber moves between different markets in a billing period, and the agent is not sure how to treat that. That person lost access to some geo-gated content in the middle of the month. And so that's a sort of low confidence scenario for the agent. And if that is the thing that triggers human review, you end up having humans reviewing $5 or $10 decisions. Meanwhile, the agent may very confidently issue a refund to a certain corporate account that attaches to a meaningful amount of revenue. And that's one where anyone with responsibility for revenue targets is going to really wish that they had gotten an account representative involved. So again, this is less about how confident is your agent and more about how bad is it if your agent is wrong. The second thing to think about here is the trigger should be explicit and testable. So explicit meaning you can articulate a very clear rule for when the human is going to get involved, not relying on vibes alone. And then testable meaning you can create evals for specific high-risk scenarios so that you actually know if your trigger is going to get triggered. I mentioned evals. I think at this point, evals mean different things to different people in different contexts. Here I mean specifically scenario-based tests that can answer questions clearly like, does this require a human? Like, would this cause harm? Would this cross a trust boundary that we care about? Things like that. So a couple examples of explicit and testable triggers for human involvement. One might be external publication. So flag for human review anytime this is going to be published to an external channel. As I mentioned, that's a big one for us. All of our journalism is reviewed by editors. Second, you might have a one-way door trigger. So flag for human review if the agent's action is going to be irreversible, in which case you want to sort of define in the set of actions an agent can take which are considered irreversible so we know when to flag it. You could have a rule for blast radius. So flag for human review anytime this decision is going to affect a certain number of users or impact a certain amount of revenue or something like that. And then you could also have something around regulated or sensitive domains. So flag for human review anytime you're looking at financial data or medical information or things like that. And then lastly, another example is scenario-based triggers. So this is one where red teams can be very powerful, and hopefully you sort of identify those high-risk scenarios without learning them the hard way. But one example for us is CNN Underscored makes product recommendations, and we have AI-generated product summaries that are based on editorial content. For us, we have a sort of set of scenarios that we flag for human review, like any product that deals with firearms or alcohol or religion or anything where we want to make sure that we have the appropriate level of sensitivity around it. The next thing to think about here is basically minimizing unnecessary review. So you want your trigger for human involvement to basically catch only what matters. And this is a little bit of a Goldilocks principle, because if your trigger is too permissive and lots of things go through, then people sort of introduce manual checks, like just in case, because they don't feel confident, in which case you've sort of, again, undermined their agency. But on the flip side, if the trigger is too broad or fuzzy and people are reviewing a lot of decisions that they would approve, then you get a sort of rubber stamping effect where your reviewers are not paying as much attention as you'd like. So you want to sort of scope it to basically reduce volume and make sure that you are minimizing any unnecessary review. Okay, so the second question here in our design is, what is the human actually doing? And this is a design choice that directly affects how scalable and how effective your agent can be. And there are many kinds of feedback that humans could provide. It could be adding weights, it could be a stack rank, but most of them sort of fit somewhere on this range between a sort of minimum amount of information in a binary response and a maximum amount of information in like a sort of fully open-ended review. And the trade-off here at a high level is very clear. Binary review is going to be great for speed and scale, and then open-ended review is going to be great for learning and judgment. Okay, so thinking about binary for a second, that could look like approve or reject, archive or delete, something like that. This is fast, it scales very well because it's low effort, and humans are going to tend to be consistent with binary review. It also can be great for a system that needs a sort of check, like a gate, like a safety gate, for example. The downside here of binary review, though, is that you are not actually telling your agent why you made the decision that you made. So it's a very weak signal for the agent, and it also is going to generally tend to struggle with ambiguity. So you want to use binary review when the decision criteria are very clear and the risk is very well understood. So that could be something like, does a certain user behavior violate a policy? In this case, the job of the human is not to teach the model, it's really to gate a specific action. Open-ended review, on the other hand, can look very different. It could be comments, it could be edits, it could be full sort of rationales or explanations. This gives your agent a lot more information, so it captures the judgment, and it's going to be best for improving the agent over time. The downside, though, is much more expensive, and so it doesn't scale as well, and it's harder to standardize because, again, different people are going to have different input. So this is best to use more when either the rules are changing or evolving, or alternatively, when the rules involve a lot of nuance. So again, for us, this is where editorial judgment comes in when we're building editorial tools. In reality, this is going to actually probably look much more like a hybrid. So you might have a binary decision where you approve or reject, but you only provide open-ended feedback when you're rejecting something. Another kind of common pattern would be staging. So you give the agent lots of information early on, and then that becomes more binary over time. So ultimately, this is not a question of which is better. It's more of a question about which is appropriate, and you want to sort of optimize for safety or for smarts. Okay, the third question here is, if you are having the human provide some judgment, what happens after they act? And you want to make sure that that judgment is captured in future improvements, which could be updating prompts, it could be changing evals, it could be training data, but ultimately you want to reduce your future workload so that type of feedback is not happening as much in the future. And this is where evals can be very powerful, because you want to make sure that you can very clearly see where human in the loop is just compensating for bad system design, or alternatively, where risk is genuinely going down. So one example, maybe if an agent is generating metadata for video segments, and it reviews a video segment about a study that finds that adding a PM to your meeting increases meetings by 50%. Clearly hypothetical. If the agent then adds that finding as metadata without including according to or according to a small study, things like that, that's going to be problematic, right? Then you're going to have people blaming PMs for all of the calendar problems. So a good eval is going to help us identify that the agent is missing critical attribution and lead us to sort of redesign that as a required metadata field. So ultimately, that helps us answer questions like, are we ready to downgrade human review? And if we did that, what would the potential blast radius be? One other quick note is the importance of repetition as a signal here. So if your human reviewers are providing the same feedback over and over again, that should be encoded into the system. One example we saw is in 2025, we had an editorial assistant tool that continuously referred to Kamala Harris as Vice President Harris, for example. Editors continuously updating that as former Vice President Harris, and that ultimately helped us identify a gap in the way our system was updating for new information. So ultimately, if your review reduces workload, then your judgment becomes leverage. Okay, and then the last question here is, if the goal is to reduce future workload, how do we actually affect that, and how does it change over time? And here what we want to think about is defining your success criteria very clearly upfront and making sure that it can be evaluated against data and observations. Again, good vibes is great for life, not so great for product management. And the failure state here is less of a technical failure and more of an organizational failure. So if you don't clearly define a downgrade criteria, then your human in the loop review is going to just tend to stick around indefinitely. Okay, so ultimately, as AI systems become more agentic, we as product leaders are going to be deciding, where does judgment live in the system? It isn't going to be everywhere, and it isn't going to be nowhere, but we have to figure out where it really counts. And if we get that right, then human in the loop can actually help us move to where we want to be on this spectrum, and we can unlock all the benefits of agency without undermining trust. Thank you.